The night shift had just begun, and I was already exhausted. It's strange, but after all these years working as a hospice nurse, you get used to the silence, the stillness, and the feeling that something's always just a little off. But this particular night it was different. I could feel it the second I stepped through the doors of the facility. There was something in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it was like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had been at the hospice for nearly 10 years at that point. Most nights I could predict what would happen, a few quiet hours of charting, the occasional call light from a patient needing help, and the hum of machines in the background. But this night, it felt like the stillness was pressing in on me. Even the usual comforting smells, clean linen, antiseptic, the faint whiff of lavender from the lotion I used for patients seemed muted, swallowed by the heavy silence. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the soft amber glow of the sconces on the walls. The building was old, nestled in a quiet corner of town, a place that had seen decades of lives come and go. The air in the East Wing was always thick, heavy with history, and tonight, it felt like the weight of every patient that had passed here lingered in the walls. My station was at the far end of the hall, near room 4, but tonight, my assigned patient was in room 7, a man named Mr. Langston. I'd seen him on previous shifts, a tall, thin man in his mid-80s with a quiet dignity that never quite masked the sadness in his eyes. Pancreatic cancer, advanced, been with us for just over a week. He was a man who didn't like to ask for help, didn't like to show weakness, but everyone around him could feel that his time was nearing. The first few hours passed uneventfully, with Mr. Langston's vitals remaining stable, his breathing steady but shallow. I checked in on him every half hour, just as I had been instructed. Each time I found him awake, his eyes following my movements, his lips barely parted, as though he had something to say but didn't have the strength to speak. When I adjusted his oxygen, he reached out weakly, placing a hand on mine. His grip was fragile, like the last leaf on a tree just before winter. "You're here," he whispered each time, his voice barely audible, as though he was reminding himself that someone was watching over him. Around 2:30 a.m., the air seemed to change. It wasn't a temperature shift or any change in the room that I could pinpoint, but something about it felt different. I glanced toward the hallway, but it was empty, silent. I did my rounds, making my way to room 7. The door was ajar, and I could see the faint glow of his bedside lamp casting long shadows across the floor. As I stepped inside, I froze. Mr. Langston was sitting up in bed. He had never been able to do that without assistance in the past few days. His face was pale, but his eyes, usually dull with exhaustion, were wide open, as though he was staring into something I couldn't see. "Mr. Langston," I asked softly, my voice shaking slightly, "what are you doing?" He didn't respond at first. His gaze was fixed on the corner of the room where the shadows seemed unnaturally dark. Then he spoke, his voice rough and slow. "They're here," he whispered, barely above a breath. "I'm not ready, but they're coming." My heart skipped a beat. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of his words. "Who's coming?" He turned his head slowly toward me, his eyes wide, pupils dilated. "They've been here for a while," he said, his voice trembling, watching, waiting for me to go. I looked around the room, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing. The room was still, but the air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me, suffocating the words I wanted to say. "I'll be right here, Mr. Langston," I said, trying to reassure him, trying to convince myself that I wasn't feeling the same creeping dread. I stayed with him, adjusting his pillow and smoothing his blanket, but something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but I had this undeniable feeling that we were no longer alone in that room. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on us, suffocating the space. After what felt like hours, I left his room to check on the other patients, but as I made my way down the hall, I noticed something strange. The lights in the hallway, which had always been a comforting, steady glow, were flickering. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the lights above me. They flickered again, once, twice, then they went out completely. I stood frozen in the dark for a moment, the sudden silence pressing in on me, the faint hum of the oxygen machines, the distant sounds of the HVAC system, all gone. The air felt thick with tension. A faint creaking sound echoed from somewhere in the building, followed by what I could only describe as a low, unsettling whisper. I spun around, my heart racing, but the hallway was empty. The air was heavy, thick with the same oppressive presence I had felt in Mr. Langston's room. I ran back to room 7, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what I would find. As I entered, Mr. Langston was still sitting up, his gaze now fixed on me. "You felt it too," didn't you?" he said, his voice low and hoarse. "They've been here for years, waiting for the moment when I would finally be ready to go." I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I looked at the corner of the room again, where the shadows were now impossibly deep. The faint whispering was back, like a low murmur in the back of my mind. "I can't stay anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But don't worry, you're not alone." Just as I reached for my phone to call for help, the lights flickered one last time before going out entirely. The room was plunged into darkness. Mr. Langston's breathing grew shallow, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest slowing. "I'm ready," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the silence that had taken over the room. Before I could react, the room grew cold. The air was heavy, thick, pressing down on me. My body went rigid with fear. And then, silence. A silence that stretched on for what felt like hours. I reached for the call light, but it was dead. I couldn't explain it. When I finally turned on my flashlight, I found Mr. Langston's body lying still in the bed, his face peaceful, as though he had simply fallen into a deep, eternal sleep. The tension in the room had dissipated, but the dread, it stayed with me. I called the family, and as I sat there, waiting for them to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting in that room, waiting for the moment when he finally let go. And in that moment I realized that I hadn't just lost a patient, I had been a witness to something I couldn't explain. Even now, all these years later, I can still hear the whispering, and I can still feel the heavy presence in the air. It never left. And I know deep down that Mr. Langston wasn't the only one waiting in that room that night. There are things that linger in the spaces where life and death meet, things that we can't understand, things that we're not meant to see. And I'll never forget the night I encountered them. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unnerving feeling that lingered after Mr. Langston passed. The air in the room was still thick, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, though there was no one else in the room. The clock ticked on, loud in the silence. I was still holding the flashlight, its beam dancing over Mr. Langston's face, and for a moment, I couldn't look away from the peaceful expression he wore. But that's when I felt a tan, unsettling shift in the air. It wasn't just the silence. It was something else. Something heavier. Something that seemed to have seeped into the room along with the cold. I glanced toward the corner of the room again, the same dark space where I had felt that strange presence earlier. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretch further than they should have, like they were alive and moving. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The whispering was louder now, not in a clear voice, but a low hum, indistinct words I couldn't quite make out, but they were there, all around me, pressing against my ears, surrounding me with their eerie weight. I turned quickly, my flashlight flickering as I pointed it toward the door, toward the hallway, but there was nothing there, just the empty corridor stretching out behind me, dimly lit, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The sudden cold sent a shiver through my spine, and I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the creeping unease that filled the space around me. I had to finish what I started. I couldn't let fear take over. I reached for the phone in my pocket, dialing the on-call doctor to report Mr. Langston's passing. But as the phone rang, something caught my attention. The call light in Mr. Langston's room flickered on. I froze. I hadn't touched the call button. The switch was off. And yet, the light above the door blared bright, the faint glow seeping out into the hallway. My breath quickened as I stared at it, wondering if I was imagining it. I glanced back at Mr. Langston. He hadn't moved, but then the whispering intensified. It was as though something or someone was trying to communicate, but it wasn't making sense. There was no rational explanation for what was happening, and yet, it felt like the room itself was coming alive. I hurried over to the door, praying that the light was just a glitch, but I knew it wasn't. As I stepped closer, the air seemed to thicken even more, pressing down on me. The whispering was now joined by something else, soft footsteps, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. My heart raced as I stepped into the room, the cold air brushing against my skin. The room felt smaller somehow, as though it was closing in on me. The light above the door flickered again, casting strange shadows along the walls. "Mr. Langston," I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "are you awake?" But he didn't answer. His body was still, his chest barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. He seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was too quiet now, too still. I glanced around the room once more, eyes landing on the corner where the shadows seemed unnaturally dark. It wasn't just a lack of light, it was like the shadows themselves were waiting. I stepped closer to the corner, my footsteps muffled by the thick silence. My flashlight flickered again, and I paused, staring at the patch of dark where the light couldn't seem to penetrate. And that's when I saw it, just a flicker at first, a movement that seemed too fast to be real. My eyes widened as I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the shadows, barely visible, like a blur of something out of place. I gasped, stepping back, but it wasn't there anymore. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm just tired," I muttered to myself, my voice shaking. "It's nothing, just the darkness." But as I stepped back toward the door, I felt it against cold fingers brushing against my arm. I whipped around, my flashlight flashing wildly over the room. Nothing. There was nothing there. The temperature in the room dropped even more, a chill creeping into my bones. I turned back to Mr. Langston, who was still lying motionless in bed. But now, something about his posture felt off. His head tilted slightly toward the door, his eyes still closed, but his mouth slightly parted, as though he was about to speak. I stepped forward cautiously. "Mr. Langston," I whispered, "are you okay?" No response. But then, through the silence, I heard something that made my stomach drop. His voice, faint but clear. "They're waiting." My blood ran cold. I felt the floor under my feet shift slightly, as though the building itself was moving, shifting, adjusting its weight in preparation for something. The walls seemed to pulse, the room tightening around me. And for the first time in years, I truly understood what it meant to feel watched. The lights flickered one last time before dying completely. Total darkness, complete silence. I could hear my own breath, shallow and fast, the only sound in the room. I gripped the flashlight so tightly, my knuckles white, the beam illuminating nothing but shadows that stretched impossibly far. That's when I heard it again, the whispering, now clearer, surrounding me from all sides. "They're waiting for you too," Mr. Langston whispered, his voice so faint that I almost didn't catch it. But I heard it. I heard the certainty in his voice. I stumbled back, trying to steady myself, trying to keep my mind focused, but every instinct screamed at me to leave. To get out of that room, to leave this building and never return. But I couldn't, not with Mr. Langston's final words hanging in the air. The weight of them pressed down on me, suffocating me. "I'm not ready," I whispered, trying to shake off the terrifying thought. "I'm not ready." But the room remained cold, the shadows deeper than ever, and the whispering louder. Something was waiting, and it wasn't going to let me go until it was done. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time seemed to stretch and bend in that room, as though the night itself was distorting reality. When the light finally came back on, I didn't feel relief. No, it was worse. The light was brighter than before, almost blinding. The shadows in the corners were gone, replaced with a nauseating clarity that only made the room feel even more suffocating. I turned to Mr. Langston's bed, and for a moment, I thought I saw his eyes snap open. But when I reached his side, he was still. The same stillness had returned. But something else was there. A presence. Not of Mr. Langston, but of something darker. Something that had been watching us both, waiting for the right moment to make its move. And I knew, deep down, that the night was far from over. The air in the room felt thick again, pressing down on me like it had during those unsettling moments earlier. I glanced over at the window, the faint light from the street lamp outside, casting a long shadow across the floor. It should have been comforting, the city, the night, the warmth of the familiar. But there was nothing comforting about it now. I swallowed hard and glanced back at Mr. Langston's body, the unease creeping back. It wasn't just the strange feeling of being watched anymore. It was something more personal, something that had connected with me, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to acknowledge it. There was something wrong, something deeply unsettling in the air. But as the seconds ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was alone in a way that I had never been before. Not even in the darkest hours of night, when the work was quiet, had I felt this kind of presence. I looked down the hallway through the open door. The corridor was empty, save for the dim amber light spilling in from the sconces along the walls. I should have gone to the nurse's station, checked in on the other patients, but I couldn't move. I couldn't leave him alone. Not after what he had said. Not after what I'd seen. "Who are you waiting for?" I whispered to the still form in the bed, but I knew he wouldn't answer. Not now, not ever again. I sat in the chair beside his bed, pulling it close, so close that I could feel the weight of the chair against my own body. The quiet stretched on, thick and unbearable. The weight of the silence was so much heavier than it should have been, so much more pressing. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, trying to steady my racing heart. The footsteps, they started again. The soft, shuffling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They weren't Mr. Langston's footsteps, no. His feet were still, his body motionless. I glanced around, my flashlight still flickering in my hand, casting erratic shadows across the walls. But the footsteps, they were closer now. Too close. I turned the flashlight toward the door, my hands shaking. The sound was unmistakable, clear, deliberate, like someone walking in the hall. But the hallway was still. No one. I should have checked. I should have looked, but something held me there, my body frozen in place as the whispers, that low hum, returned. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The shuffling grew louder, closer, until I thought I could feel the floor tremble under the weight of unseen feet. I had to move. I had to get out of that room, but I was paralyzed. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, my breathing shallow. My flashlight flickered one more time, and then went out completely. The darkness swallowed the room, leaving me alone with the eerie silence and the oppressive weight of the air around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The room was still again, but it wasn't the kind of stillness I had felt before. No, this was something else. It was colder, deeper, darker. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me. I reached for the flashlight, fumbling for the switch, desperate for any light. The beam flickered back to life, weak and uncertain, but it was enough. Enough to see the room as it should have been, empty, quiet, lifeless. I stepped out into the hallway, my pulse still racing. The cool light in Mr. Langston's room flickered again, the faint glow still burning, but it had grown dimmer. It was almost as if something in the room, something inside, was dimming the light itself. I took a step toward it, then froze. The whispering returned, louder now, clearer, and it wasn't coming from the room anymore. I turned toward the hallway again, the flashlight in my hand casting long, uneven shadows. The corridor stretched out in front of me, but it felt wrong, like it was longer than it should have been. I stepped forward, but the floor felt uneven beneath my feet, as though the building was shifting with every step I took. The whispers were coming from further down the hall now, from the farthest end, near the supply closet. It was faint, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they weren't meant for me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I walked closer, the flashlight's beam growing dimmer with every passing second. I reached the end of the hallway, where the supply closet stood, its door ajar. The light in the room flickered again, as though something had moved, but nothing was there. Not even a sound, just the oppressive silence. The whispering stopped. Everything went still. I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The hallway behind me was empty, but it felt too still. The air, so thick earlier, was now suffocating, oppressive. I knew then that I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for a long time. I hurried back to room 7, back to Mr. Langston. The whispers were gone, but something lingered in the almost tangible presence, like a breath held too long. His room was the same as I'd left it. He was still in the bed, his eyes closed, his body still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something inside that room, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I sat beside him again, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I had just experienced. I could feel my heart beat in my throat, and as I looked around the room one last time, I saw it, in the corner, a shadow. It wasn't the shadows from the lamps. It was different, deeper, darker. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The shadow in the corner seemed to grow, as though it was pulling in the darkness around it. The whispering came back, but this time, it was louder, closer, and then, as quickly as it had started, it was gone. I stood up, my legs weak, my body shaking, but there was something in me that told me I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to stay. I had to understand what had just happened, what had been waiting for me. The cool light flickered again. This time, the glow was faint, like it was struggling to stay on. I took a deep breath, reached for the light switch, and clicked it off. The room went dark, and in the dark, I heard it. One final whisper. "You're next." It wasn't Mr. Langston's voice. It was something older, something ancient, and it knew me. It knew my name. I stood in the dark, unable to breathe. The whispering had stopped, but its presence lingered, hanging in the room like an uninvited guest. My heart was thundering in my chest, each beat so loud that I thought Mr. Langston could hear it from where he lay. I tried to steady myself, but the air was thick, suffocating, as if the room itself were alive and pressing in from all sides. I stared at Mr. Langston's motionless body. His face was still serene, as though he were simply sleeping, unaware of the strange events unfolding around him. But deep inside, I knew something had changed. The room felt different, heavy, charged with something beyond human understanding. The coldness I had felt earlier was back, only now it was colder, more pronounced, and the quiet seemed even deeper. I turned toward the door, thinking of stepping out, of running to the nurse's station and calling for help, but I couldn't leave. It felt wrong, like a promise I hadn't kept. I had to stay with him, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. The light flickered again, casting strange shadows across the walls. I couldn't look away from the corner where the darkness seemed to thicken. It wasn't just the lack of light. It was like the shadows themselves were watching, waiting. I forced myself to move, to break the silence. Mr. Langston. My voice trembled as I whispered his name, though I knew he wouldn't answer. Is there anything I can do for you? No response. The stillness was oppressive. The only sound was the rhythmic, shallow breathing that still came from his chest. Yet somehow, it felt wrong to calm. To final, the air seemed to close in on me again. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. But they weren't coming from the hall. They weren't coming from anywhere I could physically pinpoint. They echoed in the air, soft but deliberate, like they were coming from the walls themselves. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned around, my pulse quickening. There was nothing, no one, just the quiet hum of the oxygen machine and the rhythmic beep of Mr. Langston's monitor. But the footsteps, they kept coming, slow, methodical, as if someone was walking toward me from behind. But when I turned to check, no one was there. My hands trembled as I clutched the flashlight, its light flickering and sputtering like it was trying to warn me, trying to make me see something I didn't want to see. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The room went silent again, but the silence felt full. It felt like something was holding its breath, waiting. I stood there, frozen in place, eyes darting around the room, expecting something to appear, to emerge from the shadows. My heartbeat seemed to fill the entire space as I waited, as I listened for whatever was coming next. The light flickered one last time, then went out. A perfect darkness swallowed the room. In that moment, everything seemed to pause. The world held its breath. Even Mr. Langston's breathing seemed to slow. I leaned closer, trying to listen for any hint of life, any hint of movement, but there was nothing, only the heavy, oppressive silence, thick with anticipation. Then, I heard it again, the whisper, but this time, it wasn't coming from Mr. Langston. It was a voice, low and chilling, one I recognized from nowhere. It was the same voice that had been in my head, echoing in the darkness, the voice that had spoken my name. You're next. It felt like the room was closing in on me. The walls seemed to pulse with the words, as if they were alive, feeding on my fear. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from Mr. Langston, who lay so still, so lifeless, but somehow so aware. I was trapped, suffocating in the weight of the air that pressed against me, thick with the presence of something I couldn't name. The whispering grew louder, the words blending into a low hum. I couldn't tell if it was just in my head, or if the room itself was alive, speaking to me, but I could feel it. I could feel it in the depths of my chest. I reached out toward the light switch, desperate to end the nightmare, but my hand stopped midair. Something inside me warned me not to move. Something told me that leaving would be worse, that breaking the silence would be the one thing I couldn't come back from. The shadows in the corner seemed to stretch, crawl, like they were alive, reaching toward me, pulling at my feet. The temperature dropped again, colder now, as if the room had suddenly been filled with ice. I could hear the low rhythmic tapping, not from the walls, not from anywhere I could explain. It was just there, a constant, methodical tapping, like someone counting, waiting for the right moment. I glanced back at Mr. Langston. His face was still, serene, but his eyes were wide open now. Wide and locked on me. I'm not ready, he whispered, his voice low and hoarse. His lips barely moved, but I heard it clear as day. I stumbled back, shaking. My flashlight flickered one last time before dying completely. The room was now consumed by darkness. There was no light left, no way to see anything, but I could feel something coming closer. The tapping grew louder. It was right in front of me now. The very air around me felt thick, suffocating, as though the space itself was about to collapse. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the blood rushing in my ears, and then, as if on cue, the door to Mr. Langston's room creaked open, but no one was there. No one had entered. The hallway was empty. I could see the faintest outline of the hallway light flickering, casting shadows along the floor. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the whisper. The voice again. This time, it was clearer. It wasn't a question, it wasn't a plea, it was an order. Leave now. I froze. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through my chest, settling in the very marrow of my bones. My body didn't obey. I didn't move, but the whispering didn't stop. It became frantic, louder, more desperate. Leave. I finally stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from Mr. Langston. His eyes, wide and pleading, followed me as I backed toward the door. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know how to, but I knew that whatever had been waiting in that room, whatever had been lurking in the shadows of the hallway, was still there, waiting for the next soul. And as I stumbled out of that room, the last thing I heard before the door slammed shut behind me was the low, guttural whisper from the darkness. "You're next." Thank you all for joining me on these journeys. Your support means everything, and I love reading your reactions and personal experiences in the comments. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat or gave you chills, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more haunting stories. Have you ever experienced something similar, or perhaps you have your own unexplainable story to share? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, don't forget to share this video with them. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories. And remember, sometimes the scariest tales are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, if you dare.